promises to be an exciting conversation with Judy Norsigian about her life story, which again I think illustrates the pivotal role that storytelling and dialogue play in education. When I was designing CHSS 205, learning activism and social movements last year, it never crossed my mind that I would ever be privileged to have a live conversation with a person who has been an important actor in one of the many important historical social movements that we also cover in our course. And that would be able to reflect together with her on the important milestones of her life journey, her lifelong activism, and the lifelong learning process that it has all triggered. But first, before I kind of continue to introduce Judy and Gayane, I just want to take a small detour first, because I need to thank a small group of Flex alumna who organized the first unofficial In Conversation series last year on our campus, when they approached some of the faculty to hold discussions with us in informal settings around our life story experiences. The idea of today's event is inspired by those wonderful collective discussions, and we do hope that this inaugural official In Conversation will be the first of many more to come. How thrilling and also fitting it is then that Judy, as our first guest of this series, so generously accepted to have this conversation with us, moderated by Gayane, an alumna of the 205 course from last spring, and also a mentor of the current 205 cohort. I also want to thank all the other people who made this event possible. A big thank you, obviously, to Dean Melkonian for all her encouragement and support throughout. Thank you to Louisa and Garine for making all the logistics aspects seem like an utter breeze. We also owe thanks to Dr. David Disajanian, Gayane Tegosyan, and Nektar Harichunian for making the simultaneous interpretation possible this evening. And a final thank you again to Gayane for being on board with me from the very first moment and for working tirelessly to make this event a successful one. So a quick tour first of the bios before our conversation unfolds. Judy Norsigian was a founding member of Our Bodies, Ourselves, or best known by its acronym OBOS, in 1971. Served as its executive director from 2001 to 2015, and currently chairs the board of this organization, best known for the landmark publication Our Bodies, Ourselves. She co-authored all 8 Simon & Schuster editions of this book, named by the US Library of Congress as one of 88 books that shaped America. She was also a member of the editorial teams that produced Our Bodies, Ourselves, Menopause, and Our Bodies, Ourselves, Pregnancy and Birth. OBOS seeks to advance the health and human rights of women and girls globally. Judy has appeared on hundreds of television and radio programs, including NBC Nightly News, Al Jazeera, The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Early Show, Oprah, Fox News, and The Current. She has served on numerous boards for organizations such as the National Women's Health Network for 14 years, and Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research for an impressive 24 years. Personal recognitions include the Public Service Award from the Massachusetts Public Health Association, the Radcliffe College Alumni Association Annual Recognition Award, and the Massachusetts Health Council Award. She holds honorary doctorates from Boston University and Simmons University. Gayane Alabadian is a senior English and communication student at the American University of Armenia. She currently works with local and international educational organizations and manages the logistics of their training courses. Gayane is also one of the co-authors of Armenian Wonder Women, a children's book that will feature stories about 40 fascinating Armenian women. So Gayane will first conduct the conversation based on some prepared questions that we hope will draw the larger trajectory of Judy's, the larger contours of Judy's trajectory. And then we will open the floor to questions that you may want to ask Judy. We also have two handouts that Judy has specially prepared for us, and they're at the front there at the small table. One of them is about August today, and the other one is a resource sheet on women's and health issues. I encourage you to take a copy, and we also have digital versions of it for those of you who may be interested. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atarian, for that amazing introduction. And thank you very much for agreeing to this. It's truly an honor. And as mentioned, we want to know your trajectory. We want to know all your journey. We want to know it from the very beginning. So I'd like to start our conversations in your childhood. And what was it like growing up in an Armenian family in America? Whatever you can share with us.
Sure. I think in the 1980s, I actually wrote an article about this for an English Armenian literary magazine, and I should go back and look at it again. I was one of 5 children, was raised in Watertown, Massachusetts. My father escaped a genocide at 5 years old. His younger sister was 2, and my grandmother through the woods. They were escorted by a Kurd, and they made it to safety. They were among the lucky ones. My grandfather had already come to the United States hoping that he would be able to bring them over before what he knew and other Armenians knew was coming, which was this genocide. Not everyone believed that it wouldn't or couldn't happen. My father had a fair amount of discrimination as a young Armenian man. He first was based in Marseille from the time he was 5, 6 years old until he was about 16, and he was then moved to the United States with his family, and he entered Boston English High School without any English. He knew Armenian and French. He was excellent at mathematics. In fact, that's what he would have done. He would have gone into mathematics. He actually was accepted at MIT. That's when his father died, and he had to work during the day and go to night school. And he became a time study engineer instead of following his dream. But as I was growing up, he shared his love of mathematics with me, and that was a tremendous gift from him. He also was a reader of interesting and important intellectual thinkers in the United States: George Santayana, Dewey, Bertrand Russell. He gave me Bertrand Russell's book, Marriage and Morals, to read when I was 12. If you read that book, you will realize that's a remarkable thing for a father to give a daughter. And he was also very supportive of some of the social justice movements in the United States. He died too young. He was 59, and it was a very sad time for me. I was just 22 years old, and I certainly missed him dearly. But I would say that his influence, his awareness of the Armenian genocide, about social justice movements, and for example, when my aunt, his younger sibling, was all upset about the fact that my younger sister was dating a black man, they were in their teens, and she would come downstairs and, Seve, and go on and on about how it's terrible that my sister was dating this black boy. My father would say, go upstairs and mind your own business. He would tell me that she is not able to understand the kinds of issues that we were learning about, that she was so close-minded from so many years of living as she had, that he tried a little bit to change her mind, but he never expected her to become a progressive thinker. Certainly didn't expect her to be open to African Americans in the United States. She had, what I saw among other Armenians in Watertown, a fair amount of racism in her bloodstream. My father wasn't like that, and my father was really one of the most important reasons that I took off with a very strong social justice consciousness as a young person. And I also knew a great deal about the genocide from a young age. I had Armenian friends whose families would never discuss the genocide. Not only did my father, my great aunt would tell me the story of her forced march across the Syrian desert in her broken English. That seared in my mind forever. wanted to repeat some of the things she said, and I can't. She was what now, as I look back, a victim of post-traumatic stress. Never got therapy, never got help, and she probably lived through this trauma over and over again because she never got help to move beyond it. She also was made infertile by that forced march and was never able to give birth. She lost an eye, she witnessed horrendous atrocities, and I could feel in her a kind of pain that transmitted across generations, and it made me understand that what happened back then isn't just about back then, it's about the present. And then of course I grew up and I would see genocide after genocide. We haven't learned from our historical examples, and I would realize that, you know, human beings' capacity to be inhumane towards other human beings was going to go on for a very long time, and it needed a lot of activists. And we need it in every sphere, not just around Islamophobia or fear of immigrants or fear of gays and lesbians, which I know is a huge issue in this country. The fear of someone who is different from you, whether it be religion, whether it be the way you're raised, things you like to eat. The fear of someone who is different is such a worldwide phenomenon. And it takes love and expansiveness and openness and an ability to reach across what is a huge divide to get people in conversations that enable others to see that they do not need to be afraid of the person on the other side. That if you teach young children about human sexuality, that's not going to turn everybody into a gay person. Or in the United States, our debate for many years is if you teach teenagers about contraception, they're going to all go out and get pregnant. In fact, it doesn't change rates of sexual activity among teens when you give them information. What it does is it changes the percentage of sexual encounters where protection is used. That's all it does. So there's less disease and there are fewer unintended pregnancies. And this is an important issue because for women in many countries, and even still in the United States, one of the most serious causes of infertility was PID, pelvic inflammatory disease, which was caused by sexually transmitted infections that never got resolved right away and led to infertility and a huge amount of heartache for the women. And this was even before IVF came along and some of the technologies that enabled women to overcome fertility problems. So I have to say that my mother was progressive too. She was a member of the League of Women Voters, but she was born in the United States. She did not have first-hand experience of some of the kinds of discrimination that my father did. And she was also 13 years younger. However, her parents were born in Armenia, and I spent a fair amount of time talking to all of my relatives, old and young, about this issue. So you can imagine, you know, I go through school, I do very well, and I'm playing the cello, and I play in the Armenian church events, and I go to Sunday school, and I even went to Armenian school for a while, and I could read and write in the alphabet, and I didn't know what I was reading because it's phonetic, but it was, it's something I intend someday to go back to. And I was really moved by the changes that I saw in the Armenian church. For example, at St. Stephen's in Watertown, the director of the Armenian Sunday school was a woman named Virginia Tastian. How many of you have heard of her? Okay, she directed the Newton Public Library, the free library system. It was at one point considered the most impressive public library system in the United States. It still is an amazing public library system. She was a visionary and a woman who traveled around the world, an extraordinary woman. She also was head of the Armenian Sunday School at St. Stephen's, and she insisted that every teacher teach at a certain point, maybe it's 9 years old and above, teach about all the world's major religions. So I learned about Buddhism and Shintoism and Catholicism. I was really impressed with all the things I learned at Armenian Sunday School because she understood that she needed to teach tolerance. And religious tolerance was one way you can teach tolerance. she was amazing. And she came into my Sunday school classroom occasionally, and she would regale us with stories and read to us, and I will forever be grateful to that woman. I think it's one of the reasons why some of us who grew up in that particular group were far more aware and accepting, and not like my Catholic girlfriend who lived up the street who said that because I wasn't Catholic I was going to go to hell. She had all kinds of weird ideas about how being Catholic was the best thing in the world. And I knew from being in Sunday school that wasn't right. And so I had language to provide in my conversations with her. So I will stop there, but it gives you a sense of my growing up. I was in a school that had a fair number of Armenian students because Watertown was known as Little Armenia back then. Almost a third of the population became Armenian. And I also felt that my Irish friends, my Italian friends, my Greek friends, all understood something about being an immigrant because we're all close to that experience. And it was very different back then from now, where I have to say I'm embarrassed by some of the right-wing and small-minded attitudes of Armenians who are not closer to that generational experience. There are a lot of Armenians in the community in the Boston area who supported President Trump. I say that with embarrassment because to be an Armenian and to understand the importance of so many of the values we learned growing up means that you cannot support a man like that. And I do have a few Armenian friends who said, well, you know, I'm not going to vote for him, and you know, probably I won't make as much money in my investments, but I could never vote for someone who stands for those kinds of values. So there are a few, shall we say, men and women of means I know who will not vote for him and understand that it may hurt their pocketbook, but it really will provide them with a certain amount of moral comfort that they're doing the right thing. So you can ask another question. Otherwise I'll go on forever.
But I don't think the mic's working. Yeah. We already touched upon this briefly. You mentioned that you grew up with 4 siblings and your relatives and your friends, but what was your main circle like? Are there still people who were in your life, and what was their impact in your journey?
I had many friends from grade school on, some close Armenian friends and non-Armenian friends, and some of them, 5 or 6 of them, I've stayed in touch with ever since. We still have little reunions. One of my closest friends in kindergarten and 1st grade, Anita Kardashian, died a few years ago. It was very sad for me. Her daughter, who went to Harvard and was an intern at Our Bodies Ourselves for several years, and then she worked in our office, and she does amazing work in the public health field. Her daughter and her daughter's younger sister, whom I also know, she's a nurse midwife in New York City, both had wonderful conversations with me about the influence of their mother on their life choices, very similar to my own experiences. And I think that I have seen a few examples of this where somebody was a childhood friend who shared many of the values I did, really expressed their views in such a way that their children adopted similar values. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes, like one of my dearest friends in the Our Bodies Ourselves collective, she's very progressive, and her son is a very dedicated Republican. And he is totally different from her, and it's in part because her ex-husband was conservative, but you know, you can't always choose the values and the perspectives your children will adopt based upon your own views. Sometimes your children reject everything you stand for. So I feel very grateful that I'm one of the lucky ones, and my daughter is someone I admire so incredibly so, and she is an activist and a progressive person, and the mother of a beautiful 16-month-old baby boy right now, who's the apple of my eye.
You mentioned about doing well in school and your Sunday schools, but what about your further education? Where did you do college? What was that experience like?
Well, Anita and I went to Radcliffe together. I was valedictorian and she was salutatorian. And we did not actually see that much of each other well in college. That's what happens, you kind of go off in different directions. And at first I thought I was going to major in biochemistry and then philosophy, and I ended up in something called social relations, which was a mixture of sociology, anthropology, and psychology. And I had some amazing psychology professors at Harvard. And it ended up with my being interested in education, believe it or not, and in particular student-directed learning, the Leicestershire system in the UK. And I graduated thinking a lot about how children learn and what kinds of environments promote the most productive learning experiences. And it was not long. I worked for a year with disadvantaged youth in a very poor part of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was co-director of a teen center. And then I met the women who had just produced the little newsprint edition, which you see in the beginning of this PowerPoint blue presentation. It's the Boston Women's Health Book Collective had already come together, not officially, it was an unofficial group, and produced this newsprint edition. And it was then I met these women. And it was then that my future trajectory was shaped. I loved them. They were all older than I was. They were all very impressive, all college educated. But you have to remember, back in 69, 70, 71, every one of us was so ignorant about our bodies, it would amaze you to see women with PhDs and masters and all level of education to know nothing about pregnancy, anatomy, physiology. These things are so central to who we are, and they really are far more important than I ever thought. I was, of course, the youngest and had a little bit more exposure to this information, but I loved the fact this group existed. And what was missing in the first newsprint edition was a chapter on nutrition. And I'd become very deeply interested in nutrition as one of the most important means of staying well. And my mother, who was a food nut, and she taught yoga, and she was, always talking about what you ate and getting enough sleep, and she loved music. My mother was great, but she was obsessed about food. And I sort of imbibed a little of that from her, and I started to get very interested in organic farming and gardening. This is in the very early 70s, and wanted to see good material in the next edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves about food and nutrition. And I did co-author that first chapter for the 1973 Simon & Schuster edition. We did not incorporate as an official organization, a nonprofit organization, until early 1972. And the reason we did that was so that we could sign a contract with a publisher. Because the early newsprint edition was with the New England Free Press. They published it. There was no contract. It was all word of mouth. And because 250,000 copies of this little newsprint booklet sold word of mouth, the commercial publishers were very interested in it. They knew it would be a bestseller, which it was. And from then on, I decided to get very interested in all these other issues: reproductive health issues, maternity care, environmental health, violence against women. And the book was extraordinary in that it traversed the globe. Women would come to the United States, discover the book, take it back, and create a translation or a translation adaptation that would meet the cultural and linguistic needs of women in their region. This was an extraordinary thing for us. We didn't initially think that this book would go across the globe. What we did think about very early on in the 70s was there are Spanish-speaking people in the United States. So we took some of our royalties income and we paid two amazing women to do the Spanish language translation of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and Nuestros Cuerpos, Nuestras Vidas was produced, and there were two printings in 77 and I think it was 76 and 77. And believe it or not, one of the fossil fuel companies funded the printing of the book because there was a woman in the foundation there who loved it. It's amazing what friends in high places can do. And the book itself reached many parts of Latin America, and then finally in the year 2000 another edition was produced, collaborating with 23 groups across Latin America, but produced in the United States with 7 Stories Press, Siete Cuentos, which is based in New York City. So we did pay a lot of attention to Spanish language information and materials from the outset, but we hadn't thought about how this book would go around the world. We knew the European languages, oh yes, because Simon & Schuster had a foreign rights agent and they were in touch with all the big publishers in Europe. So yes, we expected French, we expected German, Italian, Swedish. There were some publications that weren't surprising, but when it started to get into Eastern Europe and Africa and China and Korea and Armenia and Turkey and places like that, we were deeply moved by how a book like this could be relevant for women globally, with a lot of changes, of course.
We'll most certainly come back to the book because there's a lot to tell about the book, but I wanted to ask you about your first encounter with feminism. What can you tell us about feminism in your life?
Well, I'm not sure, actually, the first encounter. Isn't that interesting? I think I started learning about it shortly after college. During college, I was in school, 1966 to 1970. There was a lot of feminist activity in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I was playing my cello in the Harvard-Radcliffe Orchestra. I was trying to, do physics and all these other courses that took all my time. And I did not know that feminism was in fact like a few streets away. And none of my friends at Radcliffe were, at least, I do not think any of them were conscious feminists. They may have had feminist values, but, so I didn't know about it. It was when I graduated and I lived communally in upstate New York for about a year. That's when I learned about it, because some of the members of this, it was a rural commune, were professors from Fordham University and Ben Salem, which was the free university created back in the early 70s there. And it was from them I started learning about feminism and some of the trips we took to university campuses together. When I got back to Cambridge in 1971, I then immediately hooked up with feminists, because one of the people I was in an apartment with was in a men's group with the husband of Jane Pincus, one of the original people in Our Bodies, Our Selves. Her husband, Ed Pincus, was a very famous filmmaker, created the film program at MIT, introduced cinema verite, and a lot of his films are quite well known. He did some amazing filming of what went on during the civil rights movement. His most famous film is Black Natchez, which if you haven't seen, I'd recommend you do, black and white. But it was because someone I knew was in a men's group with Ed Pincus that then I found out about Our Bodies, Our Selves. So as it is with many things in our lives, serendipity, simply an accident, plays a role in hooking you up with people who really think like you do, care about the things you do. And among the women in this group were some musicians, so we played quartets as well. We played music. We were all very much proponents of the idea that no revolution is worth it unless you're having a good time. So you have to be able to dance and play music, and this group certainly had that philosophy.
Well, other than having fun, what else encouraged you to join the feminist movement?
Well, as I said, when I first went to this meeting, I resonated instantly with these women and what they were doing, and I also wanted there to be something about nutrition in the book, so that's what motivated me the most. But as I started to learn about all of these issues, now it's all in textbooks. That's why we have women in gender studies courses. Well, we didn't have them then. This is when we were learning about women's lives, by listening to women, by sharing information. Now, there were problems in the field of law and education, other spheres, the sciences, but in women's health, it was particularly stark. And I was struck by what an important tool consciousness raising was, particularly about our bodies, and particularly about our relationships. The book from the start was not just about women's health and gynecology and having a baby. It was also about sexuality and sexual relationships. And for many women, they were starting to think about these relationships in a different way. Like, why should the woman always stay at home and cook and take care of the children and not do anything outside the walls of the home? Why should it be only men who run for office and actually implement policies that affect all of our lives? Women as mothers, frequently as mothers, are sometimes the most important architects of thoughts and ideas that preserve a community and its health and well-being. So we were thinking more about how women needed to be in the public space as well as the private space. And for that to work, men had to be more in the private space as well as in the public space. So we were seeking out relationships that were more egalitarian, where both partners, say if it was a monogamous, a man and a wife or a couple, both partners could work outside the family and within the family and share whatever tasks made sense. Now, it's very interesting that some tasks take a lot of physical strength. So there were very interesting conversations about, well, you do that because you're stronger than I am, and I'll do this because I'm smarter than you are, like you do most of the family. And it wasn't always the woman or the man who did it. I lived with a man for 14 years, my late husband, who had a disability. And he was an extraordinary mind, much smarter than me in many ways, and a very famous sociologist. So I took out the trash and I did the cleaning of the house, but he would do some of the cooking. He did things he could do, but physical labor was mostly for me. So he sat with Kira and did most of her homework with her, or he read books while I was doing other things. We shared the labor based upon our abilities and based upon our strengths and based upon a little bit what we like. Now, nobody likes to clean dishes except my husband. He said, I like doing this. And my great aunt, who stayed with us for a few months, she lived with us, she'd sit there after dinner and she would look at him and say, amote, amote. She hated it that he got up and he wanted to clean the dishes. And he'd say, Auntie, I love this. She wouldn't actually believe him, but it was true. And so, but the fact that he came over and hugged her and she knew he was happy, she dropped it. There are relationships that move into this sort of new sphere of shared tasks and shared roles easily. Some don't so easily. Some come together after years of, shall we say, mental training. The consciousness raising for men and women is critically important. After so many years of socialization and cultures that teach us women should be like this and men should be like that, if you come up with another idea about how it might work, it's not usually well received. And even in the United States today, with all the work that we've tried to do in creating more tolerance and acceptance, there's a huge amount of homophobia, there's a lot of violence, gender-based violence. I could give you stories that match the stories in this country. But we have a movement, and the movement is really where the solutions lie. Individuals by themselves are limited in what they can do to bring about change. But people in numbers can. And I think you saw that a year and a half ago in this country. You had the numbers, and numbers made a huge difference. Now, as with any other sea change in countries you can look around in, like in South Africa, you're not going to see change overnight. The power structure, those who control most of the money and the resources, that doesn't change overnight. But a dream of a different world where income is distributed more equitably, where graft and corruption is at least brought down to a dull roar rather than rampant everywhere. Those are dreams that are worth hanging on to and worth working for. And I certainly have seen that. This is my 7th trip to Armenia, and I've seen 4 or 5 people, same people every time, and then I meet new people. And I would say that there is a sense of hope and a sense of possibility for change. And it may not be in the older generation, but I see it more among some of the younger men and women I meet. And I met a family over the weekend, about a half hour outside of town, where clearly the mothers, one in her 20s, one in her 30s, did not believe all the fake news about Pashinyan. Oh, like he spent $2 million on his home, he bought a private jet, and this was being told to me, translated by somebody, by the sister of my friend's wife. So she didn't think these things, but her sister did. So just like in the United States, like my cousin who reads fake news and likes, you know, Trump, this woman was believing this stuff. And I turned to my friend, a physician colleague, and I said, this sounds like fake news to me. And I said, is there any truth? And she said, no, of course not. But like in the United States, I'm sure that there are people like this woman who believe this. And they believe bad things that aren't true about Pashinyan. And it serves their narrative about what isn't going on, that he doesn't care about the Armenian people. And what was interesting is that the two younger women did not agree at all with her, but they were polite. One of them could speak a little English. And I realized that there was this respect for an older woman, that you aren't going to challenge her, but they didn't believe what she was saying. And I thought, well, that's a good sign. And the other thing is that they were offering advice to me to tell activists here. And they said, you know, we believe in the rights of homosexuals and gay people. We believe that we should have human sexuality education. But we think it's going to be harder to convince the people who are around us to change their minds if there is as much in-your-face activism. They didn't use the term in-your-face, but that's how they described it. That scares people off. And I forget what she used as an example, but as you know, in any movement, you have a spectrum of activity. Some of it is very much glaring in your face, some of it's more moderate, but you need all actors, because if you don't have the people pushing in very flagrant ways here, then those who hear the moderate voices can't get you something in the middle. So you need all the actors in a movement for social change. And what I found fascinating is that they were uncomfortable with some of what they'd seen, but nonetheless, they believed in the human rights of all people in this country, and that's what they wanted to support. So that, to me, was really a positive sign.
As you mentioned, there's the lack of awareness and there's the dissemination of fake news and all those obstacles, but in your activism, what do you think were the biggest pressures and barriers?
Well, they're not that different from what you see here. We have a very strong right wing. It's well funded. It went after our book in the 70s, tried to ban the book in libraries and schools. We've seen lots of misinformation. Even as recently in the 90s, a group of very conservative folks tried to spread rumors that having an abortion causes breast cancer. Now that is so ludicrous. Do you know we spent $125,000 on an NIH conference in Washington, D.C., where all of the scientists came together to conclude what we knew already. And that was because, and I forget who was president then, but you can be sure it was a Republican. They wanted to give a forum for this kind of discussion. That's wasting our time. Having abortions does not cause breast cancer. A lot of environmental toxins cause breast cancer and things like that, but not having an abortion. So we have faced intense opposition, particularly in the last few years, where women's right to choose an abortion, for example, has been whittled away by restrictions on abortion providers. Roe v. Wade, which, as you know, is the law of the land in the United States, legalized abortion. But having something be legal and accessible are two different things. So we have states in the United States right now where you practically cannot get an abortion. You have to travel to another state. If you're a poor woman, you can't do that easily. It's very difficult. And I know you have the 72 waiting hour period here. Well, if you're coming into Yerevan as a poor woman, you have to go all the way back. It's not easy to come back in 72 hours, and probably you have a lot of what we call coat hanger, self-inflicted abortions as a result. Well, we have that in the United States too, in places where women do not have access. There is a strong global movement to help women use medication abortion. This is administering of 2 drugs, highly safe, there's a good protocol. Ideally, you have access to medical care for the possibility of an incomplete evacuation of the uterine contents, so you would have curettage if needed. But the statistics are getting better and better for safety and efficacy of what we call medication abortion. And these drugs are available on the internet and across the globe. Many more women, including women in the United States, are seeking abortion through these kinds of medications. As a result, our national statistics are no longer accurate. It looks in the United States right now that we have had a serious downturn in the number of abortions. But we know there are many, many such abortions that don't get into the statistics, where women are privately seeking these drugs and with the help of others, basically doing a medication abortion. There's a new app that you can download called Euki, E-U-K-I, which is available globally in a number of languages, which is well-tested, evidence-based, and was produced by physicians and activists, not just in the United States, but in other countries. I think Mexico was one of the countries. And it's an app that provides good information for anyone who finds themselves with an unwanted pregnancy and is not sure what to do. Of course, it's much more useful in a country where the information about what the resources are more readily available via the app.
Well, you mentioned a very big part to fight, and to fight that you probably can't do that enough. Yes, of course.
In addition to, shall we say, attitudes against women's full reproductive control, like we still have members of Congress who don't want women to have contraceptives. It's not just abortion, it's actually access to contraceptives as well. So reproductive health issues, always controversial. But we also have a very major problem, which almost every country has now, especially with their investments. And that has to do with the inordinate influence of the pharmaceutical and the medical device industry. So many of the websites you go to now are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and the information isn't always accurate. That's why it's really important to know who's funding the website, who's behind it, where does the information come from, where are the citations. Make sure you just don't believe everything you read on the internet, that you look behind the curtain and see what the source of the validation is for what's being said. So we partnered with a filmmaker a few years back. She's now doing an amazing film about the engagement of men in the United States in trying to fight violence against women. In fact, my partner Craig is in this film. He's not here now, but she's not done with it. She's doing a series of films, and a number of them are focused on young men in universities. Really wonderful work. Her name is Carol Sensuti, and she did this amazing film about silicone gel breast implants called Absolutely Safe. Now, I brought a copy to the library here at AUA a few years back. It's available for anyone who wants to rent it, not rent it, you don't rent things here, borrow it, right? You borrow your DVDs from the library here. And it will give you a wonderful example of how women are led to believe certain things that may or may not be true. And then later on may or may not regret their decisions. In this case, the filmmaker follows a woman who seeks a breast implant. This is not for reconstruction after breast cancer, which is where, some women seek breast implants. In the United States, 85% of all the breast implants put in women are not put in women post-mastectomy, post-surgery, reconstruction after breast cancer. They are put in for what we call augmentation, to make the breast larger. There are a huge number of problems with breast implants. And the reason we don't have this well codified is that we never did well-designed long-term studies. And the industry was complicit in this. Even the FDA brought the industry to Washington, D.C. We had hearings and they said, you have to do these studies. They began the studies, but they had very poor follow-up. if you have loss to follow-up in the 40% range, as some of you probably know, that the quality of your results is compromised. You've got to have really good follow-up. So more recently, the Food and Drug Administration has posted new information since this video was produced. And in fact, it underscores and reinforces the messages in this video. We have a fairly rare form of cancer that has now been indisputably linked to silicone gel breast implants, anaplastic large cell lymphoma, anaplastic large cell lymphoma. And it is something that is completely preventable if women don't use breast implants. So you have to think about whether this kind of risk is worth it. I mention this because it's one example. We have vaginal mesh. We actually have surgical mesh that's been used for uterine prolapse repairs that has now been taken off the market, but it was on the market for a while. We have lots of examples of devices and drugs brought on the market, then taken off the market, because consumer organizations like ours worked with those who were conducting public health studies and good clinical trials. And when the findings resulted and suggested something should not be approved and on the market, we would then do the activism that made sure the government followed suit. Government doesn't always follow the scientific literature. It takes somebody rattling the cage to say, look at this literature, look at these risks. You're supposed to protect the public's health. We're having the same problem right now with our compressor station in Massachusetts, which is key to the pipeline that's going to bring fracked gas through Massachusetts up into Canada, and we can talk about that later.
Well, we know that you were a part of second wave feminism. Are there any insights that you can tell us from the second wave feminism, being part of it? What was it like? Were there any Armenian women that you know that were part of the second wave feminism?
Yes. There are many Armenian women in the United States. I'm not, and I know they exist in other countries, but I'm not, except with some of the feminists here. I don't know that many feminists in England and France and Germany who are Armenian, but they do exist even in those countries. The Armenian women I knew and have become friendly with over the past, say, 5 decades of working in the field of women's health and with other activists, have largely found their communities to be inhospitable to feminism. And that's in part why about 30-something years ago, some of us formed an Armenian feminist group, and there were about 12 women in the group. This is mostly in the Boston area, but a few were from Rhode Island, and two from New York. Partly so that we could be a support group for one another, and partly to think about how might we introduce the ideas of feminism into the Armenian community so that they wouldn't be so readily dismissed. They're actually very good ideas, but people, again, are fearful of what's different. One of the problems was the church. And I'll tell you, I have not seen so many ridiculous things come out of the mouths of priests as I have in some of the churches in the United States. I don't know what goes on here, but I've seen a few awful things, like one priest said that homosexuals should be killed. I heard that. And thanks to Pashinyan, burned, killed, whatever, that he challenged that. He challenged a member of parliament the other day who said, we don't want Pakistani and Indians in this country, some very Islamophobic comment, and I credit him for recognizing the human rights of all individuals. So there was one exception, though. And I mean, actually there are several now, and I really like them a lot. They're mostly younger priests. But one priest who spent a lot of time here and who was my best buddy in a lot of the efforts, my attempts to reach out into the Armenian community in the United States, was Dajjad Davidian. And how many of you knew him? Dajjad spent a lot of time in Armenia. He spent a lot of time with younger clergy members. And he would tell me, I almost always visited him when I was here and he was here. And he would say, don't give up hope. I am meeting younger members of the clergy who understand that we have to behave differently, that we cannot, use the old tropes of the church and expect that to work. He said young people are simply not going to stay with a church that is so small-minded, and the church is going to have to change if it wants people to stay within its contours. And I think some of that's happening. I was very sad when he died, but I have to tell you, he was a visionary and a man of the cloth, as they say, who had profoundly feminist and socialist ideas about many things. And it didn't surprise me that he was a good friend of my father's. My father was older than Dajet, of course, but they had a friendship back in Watertown that was one of the reasons I met him and got to know him. By the way, when I got married to my late husband, and he was a Jewish man, we conducted the ceremony in the basement of St. James Cultural Center, because it wasn't a religious ceremony. But Dajet came and he said a few words, and some of my friends were there, and we actually decided to do it there because that's where the offices of Our Bodies Ourselves were for about 5 years. In the basement, this was upstairs in the reception room, but in the basement of the Cultural Center. And then after that, we went to the St. Stephen's Cultural Center. So Our Bodies Ourselves has had a very important presence in the Armenian community, renting space from 2 of the major churches in Watertown. And in one case, it wasn't the church; it was the cultural center. But it's one of the reasons I made many friends, and we had many presentations. I presented to the St. James Armenian Men's Club. We had many conversations about feminist issues, and there were many people who were open-minded and receptive to the ideas of feminism. I think that this idea that feminists are a bunch of bra burners, they hate men, they this, and that's all stupid media that is not at all true. It's taking time to do away with those myths, but the core of feminism is really about creating hospitable communities for everybody, and to recognize the value of women, men, transgendered people. We have a spectrum, and it has to do with our sexuality, it has to do with our race, it has to do with our ethnicity, it has to do with our beliefs, with our religions, and it's respecting that spectrum and asking that everyone, with the differences that we see, be respectful of other human beings. That's the core of what we need, and that's what feminism has been asking of women and men and others. And I think that to the extent we've succeeded in doing that, and I think we have in large part, because we were not the most vocal, shall we say, vituperative voices that were out there. We were seen as more moderate voices, and it's partly where our book became a bestseller, because it reached women where they were at. And it wasn't preaching women and telling them, you have to do this, you have to believe this. It was saying, some women have learned these things, and then we point to the evidence. And we have experiences of women, and women didn't have all the same experiences. And when you see this panoply of experiences that women have, and men too, you realize that it's not so simple. It's not, one shoe that, fits all feet.
It's a great response, and I'm so tempted to turn the conversation into many different ways. But moving on with our question, you mentioned the book a couple of times, and I want to take it back to its origins. How was Our Bodies Ourselves conceived? Who was there? How did it all come together?
There's a very simple answer. This is all written up at our website. The history is there, so you can go read about it at ourbodiesourselves.org. The short answer is that in 1969, there was a women's liberation conference held at Emmanuel College in Boston. Emmanuel College was a Catholic girls' school, and it wasn't until recently we understood how a conference like this could be held at a Catholic school, because they were opposed to abortion and birth control. And it turns out they didn't know what they were saying yes to. So they thought these were some nice young women who wanted to have a gathering and all have workshops and learn things. But there was one student there, a Catholic student, who liked the idea, and she went to one of the faculty members and said, let's have this conference here. Out of one of the workshops at that conference, which took place over 2 days, a group of women decided to continue meeting. They had just begun to talk about health and sexuality and some of these issues about which they knew very little at the workshop. And it was their continued meetings afterwards, and they created community courses, and they did mimeograph materials, and it's a long story, and about a year and a half later it led to the newsprint booklet. But it's really a story about an organic unfolding of women talking to one another and realizing that they had profound information needs and they needed to talk to one another, that there had been a lot of isolation among some women. And this broke down the isolation. And so Our Bodies, Ourselves was created that way, and it took on just a portion of the many issues the women's movement was addressing. You know, Betty Friedan and Feminine Mystique, you know, some of these famous books. Well, they were crossing a whole range of topics. We were looking at our bodies and at sexuality in particular. And it was really because of those meetings that, and the creation of the newsprint booklet, and then getting sold by the New England Free Press, and then the commercial industry getting interested, and our creating a nonprofit organization with the royalties income that allowed us to continue this work. We never took the money for ourselves. We created a nonprofit organization, and all the royalties went into that organization and funded the outreach, some of the good projects that we saw, a women's health center. There were Native American women at Wounded Knee who wanted to create a women's health project for Native American women. We supported that. And we supported a wonderful film called Taking Our Bodies Back by Cambridge Documentary Films. And it's a little dated because it came out in the 1970s, but some of you might like to see it. And I know the filmmaker well, and I could probably get her permission to give you a link, or maybe even send you a free DVD. I think you might have to be part of Canopy to see it online now. Does anybody have a subscription to Canopy?
Yes.
You do? So then it might be very easy to see it here.
Your book has been translated into many, many languages. And how did it come to translate into Armenian? Did you have any partners in Armenia? What was that process like?
Well, back in the 90s, we connected with some women who were very interested in doing the book. And it was partly through Barbara Megarian, one of the founders of Iowa, and she's been here many times. It was partly through other networking. And there was a book that was produced, not this book, that's bigger, more like the original Big Our Bodies Ourselves, that has, it's got gold, and God, I wish I brought it. It's here in the library, so somebody could go see it. It's a beautiful cover. But of course it's older, the information's more dated, probably less revision. And that was produced with some donations. It was printed with donations from older Armenian women in the United States and a small donation from the Lindsay Foundation. You know what the Lindsay Foundation was? Krikorian. Well, you know, I looked online. I said, this should be a no-brainer. He's trying to help, you know, make things better, and this will be helpful for Armenian women. Well, there was a guy there, and I forget his name, who was clueless. And I think he...
You just know him.
What? You know him?
No.
Anyway, he kept not answering me or giving me excuses, and finally I kept pestering him. I called him up in Las Vegas, and finally we had $7,000, which was a lot of money, but I never understood what his thinking was. And I'm sure Kirk never knew about this project because it was small potatoes. It's like, it's 10 seconds of interest for him. So we got the funding, the book was printed, and then there was this wonderful meeting with Mary Hachikian when she came to the United States. And I also met the head of a public health association here, a gentleman whose name I do not remember. He came to Boston for the Armenian Medical Association. Anyway, he was the first person who told me about the World Health Organization statistics that said the rates of NGU among Armenian men are either the highest or the next to the highest in all of Europe. And that is because the Armenian men are not using condoms, and they are transmitting, they are contracting sexually transmitted diseases. It hasn't changed? Oh my God. Well, the statistics he gave me were, and this was a man, a physician, were mind-boggling, because I knew the statistics from the CDC in the United States, and I thought, oh my God, no wonder so many women are having infertility problems. In Armenia, they're getting PID at very high rates, and that was very upsetting. So I know that Mary was going to be putting in information about this, and Mary even had a storefront at the Vernissage for a while. That got her into a lot of trouble. She was accused in the papers of committing another genocide because she was going to provide contraceptives to individuals. The attitudes are very problematic, and I appreciate why individuals don't want to be public in a lot of what they do. On the other hand, if we don't get more public and do it in numbers, the stigma will continue to persist. So it's one of the reasons why having a School of Public Health and AUA espousing best practices, what we know across the globe in terms of public health and the well-being of women and children and families, is so critically important. And it will get its detractors, but you also have the support of World Health Organization and major institutions who will come to your defense. And this is badly needed, especially because Armenia is in a region where there is so much unbelievable crap, pardon my French, that is put out there for the public to believe. What I have seen in Azerbaijan and Turkey from my feminist friends is scary. It matches anything you see here. And so it's important that this voice of science and reason continue. So this book, which is a PDF file, you can get it at our website, it's easily found. I'm going to give this copy to Marianne Mukdosian because she has this wonderful art center where women come from sometimes with their children for art projects. And oh, Marianne, you're here. I didn't see you. This is your gift.
Yes, I'm very happy for that.
So I think that there actually are places where vital information can be shared with women in ways that will build up confidence to speak out and to understand these issues and to even begin the very delicate task of educating men. These two young women I referred to before who have children and they were well educated. One wants to go into get legal training and the other one wants to work outside the home. Their husbands, who are younger, do not want them to work outside the home. And this is a common problem in Armenia. And it's a waste, too, in my mind, for the brilliance that you see here. There's so many brilliant women, and they could work part-time, like many women in the United States who have children. They work part-time in what they love and do, and they can do it from the home because of the internet, or they can do it outside the home. But the idea that this should be threatening to men, that their wives might work, might do something else, might get more education, it's sad to me to see that. And I think it's going to be a one-on-one project to change those kinds of attitudes. It's not going to come from reading an article in the paper. It's going to come from somebody someone respects sitting down and talking to them about why this might be a good thing for the country, not just for you personally. And you know, thinking of creative ways to open minds to another vision of how men and women and families can be together. Okay, I'll let you go next.
Well, you mentioned that the first booklet had a lot of souls and there was a commercial interest, but in the meantime there was also this prevailing unawareness that often translates into resistance. So when the book Our Bodies Ourselves itself came out, were there any backlashes in the United States and in Armenia?
I think there was some backlash here, but not that great because I think it was carefully distributed. I think that the people who knew the value of the book wanted to distribute it, you know, to women's groups. I know there was a group of women in Dilijan who each woman got a copy. They were young women, and they met regularly in some of the other, in Gyumri, and I think even in Vanadzor. But this was not done with a lot of publicity and fanfare. This was done in a way to make it easier for women to come together, so they wouldn't be personally attacked. But it begins the process of a conversation. So I don't think there was that much backlash, but to be honest, I don't really know. I think in the United States we had a ton of backlash. We still have some. But we also have a very strong women's movement. We have a very strong public health movement. And the very first edition of Our Bodies Ourselves, there were some physicians who didn't like it because we were saying, you have to challenge what doctors tell you. A lot of what they did to women in the 70s was not evidence-based practice. Whether it was, you know, obstetrics or gynecology, you know, there were the routine hysterectomies that removed a woman's uterus for no good medical reason. There have been, to this day, cesarean sections for no good medical reason. It's actually been a growing problem, and until just a few years ago, our rates of cesarean section were going up, 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 and now they're in some places coming down because academic obstetrics and gynecology is saying we have to change this picture. But the community physicians, many of those obstetricians and gynecologists are doing things that in this day and age are totally unacceptable. We even have a problem with obstetric violence in the United States. Go look that up as a search term. It's not something from 30 years ago, it's something from the present. And it's very sad to see this, that in this day and age, women are not treated with respect, particularly when they're having a baby. That's a profoundly important moment in your life. So there is an issue here with backlash continuing, but among physicians, the opposition really changed over the years. The physicians in the beginning who were what I would call small-minded and didn't like the book, they dwindled in number. And then there were more and more physicians who liked the book a lot. They'd give the book to women who were their patients. They would say, go read this. It was actually welcomed by many physicians, and it was used in some medical schools for a while. So we, over the years, you can imagine the kind of work it takes to produce a book like this. We worked with clinicians and researchers and professors in medical schools and in public health. We wanted the best minds to be reading the material, and we also wanted women to share their experiences. But it took hundreds of people to produce the last few editions of our book, because you needed that kind of eclectic input with a range of views and even a range of professional opinions about what the literature showed. You could have 20 studies. In fact, they could be well designed. And then you ask these 5 experts, what do you conclude from those studies? And the 5 experts will give you 5 different conclusions because they read the studies differently. And we learn that over time as well. So when we had these kinds of differences of opinion, we would make them go back to the drawing board. One of the most famous examples, I will take time to share this, had to do with the value of mammography, routine mammography, not mammography after you've had a scare or a strange lump or something. Routine screening for all women, say 40 and up. The best data we have in the United States does not demonstrate an effect on mortality from routine mammography. And that was pretty controversial, how we were going to say it. We had to go back and forth with someone from the American Cancer Society and someone from you know, CDC and someone who was involved in NCI, National Cancer Institute. We wanted to make sure that the way we worded the book would not make women think they shouldn't get a mammogram if that's what they wanted. But they shouldn't believe that having the mammogram was in some way going to produce some magical result, that it was going to make the supreme difference. And, you know, we have better equipment. Mammograms expose you to less radiation now, but there is some exposure. And as you know, radiation exposure is cumulative. So if you have lots of mammograms, that exposure is cumulative. It's not an insignificant issue, but it is an issue, and it's something to be concerned about. Because the rad exposure is so low now, most women, it isn't an issue. But one of the things we don't like is the promise that a particular, say, preventive strategy will lead to this result, when in fact it won't. On the other hand, when it comes to pap tests, we know, incontrovertible evidence, pap tests save lives. And this is where you get a cervical smear, you know, you do a pap test, and you know, one of the interesting things about Armenia is before the USSR left and you became an independent country, you had almost universal pap tests, and you had very low rates of cervical cancer in Armenia. When the universal pap test disappeared, as medical care was more and more privatized, and women did not get regular pap tests, your cervical cancer rates went up again. And I know some folks at Johns Hopkins University in the United States have followed this a little bit. If you're interested, you could probably contact them and learn more. It's an interesting case study, I think. I know I'm talking too much.
That's the point for you to talk today. You mentioned a lot of problems throughout our conversation in women's reproductive health and sex education, and I want to sort of change the note of our conversation to a slightly more positive, to discuss where do the solutions begin and what's the role of education in all of this.
Well, you can never underestimate the importance of education. Education in one sphere often leads to education in another sphere. And I think literacy and literacy tools are critical. If you want to have a civil society, you have to have a literate society. You unfortunately have to have, in this day and age, a society that can figure out that some news is fake news and understand what's real and what's not real. That is one of the biggest challenges right now. What do you believe and what do you not believe, even when you can read, right? I think that we have so many good projects out there trying to educate at all levels, and particularly around women's issues, that it leaves me hopeful. I also think that you have to have enlightened leaders who understand the women's movement. They may not be able initially to make its values, its principles, its goals front and center right away, as we've seen in so many countries. But those leaders have to have their feet kept to the fire. It's like President Obama said when he got elected president. There's no magic bullet here. If you don't hold my feet to the fire, you won't see the change that you want to see. And in fact, that was the big mistake that many of us in the United States made. We did not hold President Obama's feet to the fire, and there were a number of times when you could have made a difference, and you didn't. And a lot of reasons for that, but I think a vocal public is incredibly important. So you need movements for change. And you need movements for change that can speak to one another, that understand the importance of respectful dialogue. I don't know if you know this, but back when this country was formed, was it 91? You established independence here. One of the hallmarks of your conversations in Parliament was that everybody screamed all the time and nobody listened to anyone. And the US government saw this and asked that several people come in and sit down with members of Parliament around learning mediation skills. And not that they're not good skills for everyone to learn, but simply the practice of being quiet and listening to someone else who has a different view, and being able to think about what they say, and then respond in an intelligent way. it's so critical. And I think that was a big challenge here because it was, you know, and in fact, maybe part of it was that they were almost all men, and even some of the women weren't exactly exemplary of these kinds of, you know, ways of behaving. But if you can't produce a body, a legislative body where people respect one another and at least give them a chance to speak and will listen and respond thoughtfully, your chances of getting good policies in place go down. They go down. And I think that has changed somewhat. I know there have been incidents, I've heard them, you've heard them, but I think what I've heard in terms of progress shows that things are moving in the right direction. So you have to have your political leaders, you have to have your institutional leaders, you have to have your family leaders, you know, the people in the family who have the most respect, all exhibit these kinds of behaviors. And you know, you have to teach by example, and if you don't, the younger people coming up are just going to follow the leader. They'll do what they see, and we know that to be true. It's one of the reasons why it's so important to stop domestic violence, because children see this. In the United States, we have so many studies that show children who witness domestic violence, particularly the boys, are more likely to go on and become abusers themselves, because that's what they learn growing up. It's not rocket science. So men have to understand this, and men have to think about this, and men have to find another way to deal with their anger besides violence. And women too, with children. And women too, with females in the family that they don't like. There's a lot of abuse of women against other women. It's got to stop being a way of life. And there's no magic bullet here, but more and more people who are respected, who are revered, who have status in the society have to come out and say these things, and they have to role model for others.
So, coming to our present days in your personal activism, what is your focus right now? What are you personally interested in?
Well, I'm still working on all these issues, and so is our bodies ourselves, but several years ago, I had a dream where a lot of babies were dying in a climate disaster. And I had been reading about climate change, and I was getting more and more concerned about political inaction. As you know, all over the world, there are climate change denialists, and you know, it's like, you know, genocide denialists. You know, you can hardly believe it. There's so much evidence, but they exist. And I thought I need to devote my volunteer time for what years I've got left. So I'm 71. I figure maybe I have another decade left of activism. And I would like to spend more and more time working on climate change activities, trying to support greater use of renewable energy sources, trying to stop in the United States these enormous gas leaks that exist everywhere. They're killing trees and they're a waste of money and everything else. And also trying to stop expansion of the fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly for fracked gas. And that's why I mentioned this Weymouth compressor station in Massachusetts, which, by the way, is being built in a very highly populated area. There's a school nearby. And you, if you study this issue, you know that some of these compressor stations have blown up in the United States, one or two in California. Fortunately, they were not near population centers. But it happens. And it is insane to consider a compressor station in this part, this Weymouth, Quincy area in Massachusetts. So I'm working with a group called Mothers Out Front. Some of you should take the time to go to their website. They are not just mothers, but they are primarily mothers and grandmothers and some men. One of their very active members is a professor at Boston University. His name is Nathan Phillips in the Department of Geography, and he's involved in creating an interesting panel discussion about green building, and we're inviting a gentleman from Armenia to join that panel in December. And we are wanting to share tools and ideas about how you promote green building with limited resources. There are some great things going on in Africa and Asia and other places. But this is the kind of work that I want to do, and Mothers Out Front is an extraordinary organization. It was founded by 3 women. They're very active in 8 states in the United States, but they are now forming teams and chapters in other states as well. And that's the focus of my volunteer work right now. Not that I don't do other things, but I am very committed to working on climate change, educating the public, and also making sure that the next president is not a denialist. Right. It's, I mean, there are a lot of reasons you don't want him to be president, and I certainly don't, but he, as someone who could do so much more to mitigate the disastrous effects of climate change, and we are seeing it every day across the globe, it's very scary that we have no leadership at the presidential level in the United States on this issue. So there can be a lot done at the local level, and those of you who are interested in this issue, and you don't want to be just brought down by the problem statement, which we all know about, if you want to see all the solutions that are happening at the local level, I urge you to see a film called Paris to Pittsburgh. How many of you have seen it?
I think that's because Trump said he was elected to be the president of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Yes, he did say that. He was elected to be the president of Pittsburgh, not Paris. But actually, the mayor of Pittsburgh is interviewed in this documentary, and you'll love what he says. The film is about 40 minutes long. It fits in a classroom discussion. It is in English, but somebody could create subtitles. And it points to things happening in Puerto Rico and in very interesting places where people have been thinking about renewable energy and climate change in very creative ways. And it's a hopeful documentary. It is not just gloom and doom. It was created by Bloomberg Philanthropies and National Geographic. For a while it was free online. And I'm disappointed to say it's not free online anymore. But that's okay. Maybe through Canopy you can get it, and then you could host some screenings here. That would be great. But I think it's one of the ways to get people thinking creatively and positively, and not to just feel like, oh, this is another gloomy, awful topic, and let me go have a drink and forget about it. It's we have to have more community-based climate change activists, and we have to turn this huge ship around, because we are headed to such horrible, horrible scenarios, which now very few scientists in this field are challenging or saying it's not true. Even at ExxonMobil, I know someone who works there, they all agree this is all likely to happen. They're not going to be public about it, but privately they totally agree with what you see the activists saying. They know this is what's going to happen, and that we have to do carbon sequestration, we have to do everything under the sun, not just one thing, but all the things to make sure that we reduce global warming, that we increase, less dependency on fossil fuels and all those things. So that's it.
I think we'll be continuing the topic of climate crisis a bit more with this question, but what kind of connections do you see between climate crisis, women's health, and environmental justice at large?
Well, we've already seen the effects of climate change on reproductive health in some countries where it's been measured. And I think that's what it would be helpful for more of the public to understand, not just the effects on reproductive health, men and women, but also the effects on human health. As temperature rises, certain mosquito populations grow, problems with certain diseases grow, other diseases are more likely to spread, and there are reproductive health problems that have begun to become measured. What we want to do is create greater public awareness about the link between global warming and human health. A man named Paul Epstein, who was involved in the Kyoto Protocols, a very important public health physician at Harvard School of Public Health, he died some years ago, has written eloquently about this subject, and what he said years ago still stands, I think. We absolutely have to have, more people thinking about these issues, that human health effects of climate change. Forget about the planet blowing up and weather disasters and those are, disasters where people die in floods and fires and that kind of thing. Just disease and exposure to toxic substances. This can take a huge human toll, and it becomes another reason, maybe more immediate for some people, to get active in climate change activism.
And my last question to you, so we can give some time for question and answer. What is your one message to people about activism and social justice?
Well, I think that working for social change, social justice, however you want to call it, in one way or another, can be healing at the deepest level. And a film by Cambridge Documentary Films exemplifies this by following the stories of 4 amazing women who were deeply traumatized. And I won't tell you each of the 4 stories. But the film is called Strong at the Broken Places. And it exemplifies how people who were deeply hurt, physically, emotionally, and otherwise, were able to restore themselves, to heal at the deepest level through working for social change in some way. And it's really, to me, to this day, one of the best documentaries that demonstrates how important it can be, not just for those of us who've had no great traumas. My trauma is my history. Have I had a horrible trauma in my life? Have I been raped or beaten or... No, I haven't had something like that happen. I had some close calls, but I got out of them. But there are people who don't think that working for social change will help in healing that kind of trauma they've experienced. But this film makes the point that it's really good for everybody, not just those of us who have the privilege of not being harmed by some horrible happening or experience in our life, but for everybody, even those of us who've had a trauma. And working to help people see that is also a skill. That's why we need more social workers. That's why we need more people who can do this kind of skillful therapy when people have been hurt and need to find a way back to functioning in the world without constant fear and a feeling of incapacitation, a feeling of paralysis, the kind of panic attacks so many people have now. There are ways to deal with those psychological crises and critically important realities through mutual support and community support, and finding those opportunities, which is why Mariam, your center is so important, because I think it's one such place that can do this.
Thank you. I don't think we could have found a better note to end this conversation. No, thank you very much for having that conversation.
Thank you, Judy, for this fascinating journey and for the eloquent and profound conversation. I will be opening it up now we have something like 15 minutes for questions, 10 to 15 minutes, and if there are questions, here is Actually, looking around the room now, that's something else that we really need to work on at AUA, on boys and men's engagement in these issues. I mean, serious absence of our male students. Yes?
We need 3 representatives.
Oh yes, but I mean on the student body, actually. Professors and faculty it's amazing, but yeah, in terms of our male student body. Yeah. Questions?
Thank you so much for being here. It was amazing listening to you. My question is concerning feminism, and what do you think, what's men's role in feminism?
Well, obviously, if men join in and become feminist allies, our struggles are so much easier. I could tell you so many stories where just having that guy or two with us. It could have even been a professional. Sometimes I was in meetings with mostly men, all professionals, around some women's health issue. And if it weren't for the support of one of the men in the group, I probably would have gotten no traction. It's, you know, it's a truism that in many settings, women are ignored, but men are not ignored. So it doesn't matter what you say. In fact, there have been very interesting studies that show in a conversation where the woman says one thing, it gets ignored, the man over here says the very same thing 10 minutes later, and everybody listens. This is not going to go away instantly. But it's getting better. And there are more men conscious of this, what we call innate bias. And there are more men trying to be different and trying to support this kind of thing. I know some medical students, male medical students, who, when the professor showed pornography slides as part of his presentation, and I kid you not, the male student got up and said, "This is not appropriate for you to do this." Female students could have gotten up, as some had before, but they were like, it didn't have as much weight. Sometimes something is said or done that is clearly inappropriate and everybody agrees. It really is helpful if men would stop being silent bystanders, particularly when they're agreeing that something is wrong, and say something. Not leave it always to the women to say something. And to the degree that has happened in the United States, examples that I've seen, it has been wonderful. And it's led other men to do the same thing because they're not so alone. Well, if that guy did it, then I can do it too. And especially when you do it together. So it's very hard to ask men to be brave in a culture where to do this kind of thing is considered, you know, weak and, you know, not masculine. You know, there's a lot of toxic masculinity. We are trying to create what we call positive masculinity, or images of positive masculinity, and there are a lot of them out there. Fathers who are loving with their small children, and they'll be outside taking them in strollers into the park and caring for them, and not just the whole family together, but the father alone taking care of the child. And actually on this trip, I've seen several fathers with little kids, young fathers, not just the grandparents who take care of the kids. And there was no woman there. It was just the father taking care of the child. I didn't see that before. So it's happening a little bit. And we should be celebrating that not saying, oh, what's the matter? You're staying at home taking care of me. Or you're at the playground, you know, instead of, you know, playing tableau with the guys or whatever you do. I don't know. In Watertown, that was what the men did. They went to the club and they played cards or they played backgammon, and they usually left the house right after dinner and never helped with child rearing, never helped with cleanup. That's what my father did.
First of all, thank you for this amazing conversation. You mentioned that all this intolerance and rejection is because people are afraid of everything different. But I'm just curious, what do you think? What creates those fears and how we can help them to overcome those fears? Thank you.
Well, there's no question the fears are learned. You know, we all grew up in families, in churches, in schools, in institutions that perpetuate those fears. They instill them and then they perpetuate them. You know, the child whose mother may be in jail for prostitution goes to school, and what does the teacher say to the child? You're going to be just like your mother. That happens. Happens in many countries. Do we promote the idea of stigma? People with disabilities were to be hidden in many cultures. When I went to Japan many years ago, the disability rights activists were working with my late husband, who was a disability rights activist, as well as a medical sociologist. And they said, we are having such a hard time to create this idea that public spaces should be accessible for everyone, people in wheelchairs, women with strollers, whatever. Because the idea was such a person should be hidden, kept in an institution or at home, and we shouldn't have to see such a person. And I'm sure there was a fair amount of, that attitude at one point here. It's been in every society. But increasingly, and you have a wonderful Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, and a deputy minister. I met Jana when she was in the United States, and they are deeply concerned about creating a more open society. Well, if you learn about what it means to have a disability, and you're less afraid of it, as it's not the kiss of death in many cases. It's something you learn to live with. My late husband wrote some wonderful short stories that should be translated into Armenian, I think. It's called Meaningful Relationships, Moments in Time. It's at the website I created for him, irvingzola.com. And these are personal stories that help people who are having a hard time understanding what it means to have a disability, to understand it and be more embracing of it in the society, in your own family. It's not something to be afraid of. But initially, you have grown up in a society that teaches you that's something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden. I mean, the same happens in other areas. I mean, many of us are taught growing up that homosexuality is a disease, or it's the result of Satanism, or it's this, or it's that. And how do you change that? Well, one thing that's helpful in the United States is that some parents have had children who've been gay, and they didn't want to reject their children, so they learned to love them and learned to understand more about what it meant to be gay. And sometimes if you have that in your immediate circle, it's very helpful. There's so much closeting of gayness, of disability. There are people in the United States who are light-skinned and they pass for white, and sometimes they'd rather not people know that they're of black heritage because they're going to experience discrimination. Well, that's not, we shouldn't have a society in which you're afraid of that.
I'd like to know about your opinion about Amusar mining, and I'd like you also to tell opinion what do you think how it will affect to people's health, like what will happen if they will do mining.
This subject of Amusar has come up a lot, and I attended Hurigas Atarian's class the other day where the activists were presenting a very good presentation. 2 or 3 trips ago, I went to NPAC with Mara Matosian to see a very profoundly moving photography exhibit about Kajaran, the human health impacts of that mining. It was devastating, and it was a very powerful visual statement. I've been reading about Amusar, and I know a lawyer in the United States who knows a lawyer who's working on this issue here, and who believes that Armenia is going to be able to resist the horrendous lawsuit that Lydian has brought against the country. We'll see. I'm not so optimistic. But there's no question when money of that proportion enters the picture, it's very hard to, resist the building that they would like to proceed with. Amusar's, of course, done damage already, horrible damage, and I think it's really exciting to see the community come together and to protest and to get support in the government and to try to stop something that should not happen. A lot of mining is done in a way that is avoidably unsafe. It's more expensive to mine in different ways, but it can be done. Maybe not as to a great extent, maybe more conservatively, but in some cases it isn't that mining doesn't have to happen at all, but the way it's happened in most parts, look at what's happened in the United States, is a travesty. Now, coal mines don't need to exist at all. We should be shutting them down. We don't need any more coal. You know, that's really the fossil fuel problem we should be, you know, dealing with as quickly as possible. When you're dealing with things like molybdenum and copper and gold, precious minerals that are used in the production of, like, you know, computers and other things that we all tend to use and need, it's a little more complicated. But one of the things that absolutely shouldn't happen is that if you have a vital business enterprise in this country, all the profits should not be going outside the country to some other big, you know, multinational corporation with nothing for Armenians except maybe the health problems that result. That should not be the case. And sometimes you can point to certain human health risks possibly being worth it, but you do not want people in the area where you're doing what you're doing. You should probably be traveling, basically providing transport for workers and providing safety equipment and not having people live in that area. I mean, there's a lot of things to be considered about mining, but Amulsar as it is should be stopped. And I'm very, I'm really thankful and I'm in admiration of all the community activists who have been stepping up and doing what they can to keep it from going forward. As we know, many of the leaders in this movement are women. Is it surprising? No.
I think there was a study done that showed that men don't engage in environmental activism because they think that it makes them look gay. So, yeah, that's also using plastic.
Well, you know, that might be an easy thing. Rather than talk about gender-based issues, it might be an easier way to get to some of the young men in your lives who are still nervous about this. They absolutely, if they have any brains, and if they're here at AUA, they should understand what environmental risks are, and in all the ways we expose communities to environmental hazards. And they should be willing to join in on activism that challenges the destruction of our communities. It has nothing to do with being gay or lesbian or anything else. It has to do with being a good citizen in this country. And if you get them to get past this idea, it makes them look weak when they fight for the environment, maybe the next step is to look at these other issues. Because that's pathetic, to be honest.
Thank you for the presentation. As we've talked before the presentation and you mentioned during your talk, the backlash is sometimes inevitable because, you know, the lawsuits, the people that don't agree with you, taking you to the courts, trying to pass laws that limit your ability to, you know, engage with the general public. So my question, sometimes I get fixated on these minor things, I'm sorry if my question sounds a bit stupid, but my question is, how did you deal with this backlash emotionally? Where did you find the emotional support, the people in your life? So what kept you going? Because sometimes it's just, you know, very hard.
Well, I think that I probably have a thicker skin than many people I know because of my father. And I credit him with that. I also have had a lot of support. When you have a supportive environment, you are more able to take risks. Yes, you get shot down. Yes, people say ugly things. Yes, you know, once we got white powder in an envelope in our office and we were wondering whether it was, you know, one of these awful, you know, crazies trying to destroy us. And no, it wasn't. But if you are in a community where there's support, and you can, when you have the defeats, when you have somebody say something ugly and mean, I don't always engage when somebody is talking like that as indirectly. I might say, I'd really like to talk to you, but we need to listen to each other and not yell at each other. Can you agree to have a civil conversation? They usually will start screaming and say no. And then I say, well, you know, here's my number when you can talk in a civil fashion, because I do not want to scream at you and show to other people that this is a way to communicate. Then we can talk later. I think it's really problematic to engage in screaming matches because that's what you're role modeling. Occasionally you do have to, you know, when somebody is moderating and they're not doing their job, you do have to do something like raising your voice to get somebody to be quiet. Because you're on television and you don't want them to be the only ones to say anything. So you talk at the same time and you say, you know, I'm sorry we're not having the conversation we should be having, but you talk loud enough so that their voice is muffled. There's no one solution, but you cannot do this work in isolation. You have to have people you can go home to, go out with, you know, who share your views and who will work with you. You know, on regrouping and going back out. And I think that, you know, one of the things that alarms me is the degree of physical violence that some people are exposed to. And I would worry about that a bit. I would try to think, you know, are there ways we can prevent so much physical violence? You know, think ahead. You know, are there progressive members of the police force whom you could ask to be present at something where you suspect something might happen? Because you know they won't just stand by and watch. They'll say, no, you can't do that. Are there other men, a few men who are willing to say, we're not to live in a violent culture anymore. This is not what we are now. We are a civil society, you know, who would be willing to just step up and say no to the violence that somebody might be suggesting or might be fomenting. Sometimes it gets fomented and then it leads to the violence because the words are antagonistic. There is a skill, which I don't have, but some people are learning about how you diffuse this kind of escalating language that can lead to violence. You know, screaming and yelling usually doesn't help. And, you know, it's, you know, one person said, I created this card that I, you know, make available when someone is screaming and yelling, and it tells them, I really would like to speak with you, but I cannot scream and yell. I do not believe. And in fact, one person I know said, my church has taught me not to scream and yell and be abusive. So or my God has taught me not to, you know, and that I am a Christian who cannot speak like this to other human beings, so contact me when you can speak like a Christian. Because they wanted to use the language of religion to which they thought might mean something to the person to get them to stop yelling. Now, of course, not everybody believes that, but some people do.
Thank you again. My question may be the repetition, but it's a bit of it's kind of a different question. Do you have any suggestions to feminist activists here who are facing this anti-gender backlash, the attacks, especially on sexual and reproductive health and the sex education in the schools in Armenia? What will be your, I don't know, tips for feminist activists to resist these kinds of attacks?
You know, I don't think I'm the best person to offer suggestions because I'm not as well versed on what the situations are likely to be. I think that has to come from other activists here, but I can tell you it will help a lot if you can get people at your side who are known and respected and are willing to go out on a limb. I think it's critically important for engaging men in this work that they see a few male role models who are respected. I know there have been a few singers or actors who tried to do these videos. I saw them online. You know, you're not a man if you beat a woman, and you know, I forget who they were. And one of them was a comedian. I have no idea. Yeah, and the Istanbul Convention is very interesting. That, I mean, it it probably needs more prominent people being willing to go out on a limb, be in the press about it. And I know that a lot of people are scared. I know some older professionals who are very scared about not having this kind of negative press. But I'm not sure what the best way to go about this is. And, you know, and I know schools can be very problematic now. I mean, I know that AUA is a somewhat hospitable environment, but there are limits here too. And I'd like to think that maybe some of the men at AUA younger men at AUA could be in that group that would be willing to sit down and talk about the advantages of taking these risks. It's not all, you know, going to be negative for them. There are advantages. And maybe we could start to enumerate them better and to convince them that it's worth it for them to go out on a limb. Maybe some of you have ideas.
There are no students asking questions.
Okay. Hello, my name is Hierarchy. I want to, first of all, express my admiration and to reveal something. I read Making Men Armenian in Armenian, probably I was the age of the students, before I ever heard about Betty Friedan or Simone de Beauvoir. And it was thanks to the Women's Network that word and even, I'm sure you know Lara Armenia, so I got hold of the first edition through her.
Wonderful.
Yes, and actually my question, I heard every single word you said, and my question would be like more into, you talked about awareness raising. I talked a lot, I worked a lot. My dissertation research was about bringing, like researching Armenian history and bringing women and their social activism in the 19th century. But I never found a way dealing or raising awareness among women who are either kind of cultured into patriarchal way of thinking or even misogyny, or they are like good co-opted benefits of this system. And given your experience, especially working with people in medical world, because in my experience in Armenia we have more misogynistic gynecologists than anywhere else. What would be your advice in terms of awareness raising? Because yes, finding good people around you, but oftentimes even among our friends, even among our families, even about student circles, it's really very hard raising this kind of awareness, or even during our visit to gynecologists. Based on your experience, what would you think?
You are describing one of the most profound challenges that feminists have in countries across the globe. You're describing what, in fact, we experienced too years ago, commonly. One of the things that we did early on, and still do sometimes, is that we never went to the doctors alone. And we did it for a number of reasons. One is that you're sometimes nervous when you go to the gynecologist especially, but even other doctors. And so it's good to have someone with you who can help you remember your questions. You write them down ahead of time. Or help you think of questions when you're there. And the practice of even letting a woman bring a friend into the exam room became quite commonplace. And typically, you know, some physicians were uncomfortable with that, but they said, oh, okay, why not? And women would say, I'm a little nervous and I have a lot of questions and I want to make sure that I'm well informed, so my friend here is going to help me remember them. And so there's usually receptivity to that, even if a physician is uncomfortable. If a physician is completely opposed to your having written questions, having a friend there, you probably need to leave and go someplace else. I am believing that sometimes it's better not to get an exam than it is to get an exam from a hostile misogynist.
But you will not find a gynecologist at all in that case.
No, they do exist. No, and I can tell you at the health center where, you know, in North Marash, where Mary Khachikian has, you do not get treated that way. You know, she will, there are people there who will treat you with respect. She has tried to focus on women who are more disadvantaged at times, you know, like, you know, women who've had no money to pay for health care. But I'm sure you can go there and pay for health care, and there are places like that. It cannot be true that Yerevan, a city this large, has no decent gynecologists. I know there are some. I've met them, and they would not treat a woman badly. Maybe that's, you know, that's how Our Bodies, Our Cells got started. You know, out of that workshop, the main reason the women continued to meet is they wanted to create a good doctor's list because they had so many bad experiences. And you know, when they first started to get together, and they said, oh, well, this person was good, and 98% of gynecologists were men back then, hardly any women. One of the things that they found interesting is that they had no idea what constituted a good gynecologist because they had no good information. That's when they just started to educate themselves. But they did start to put together sort of a list of, well, I went to this person and he was pretty good, and I went to that person and he was horrible. So, you know, word of mouth, you were avoiding the worst ones. If it's that bad here, you might have to start with that. You know, create some sort of a private network. I would not do Facebook because it's not private, but Yuki is a private platform, a really private platform where women can share information about problematic physicians so they can be avoided, and could promote the, you know, the better physicians. I mean, this suggests that we need to do much better training in the medical schools and in residency programs, because it shouldn't be that hard to find a decent gynecologist now.
Word of mouth has been the way that I have been using so far, but oftentimes when I'm waiting in the line, just this Saturday, several Saturdays in a row, I've seen like women with their husbands going to a male gynecologist saying that he's better because he's man. And he understands because he's a better physician than female gynecologist.
Well, that's better for those of you who are looking for a good person, because female gynecologists are less likely to be abusive. Some can be. And if other women think they're less qualified, that means you won't have to wait as long to get an appointment. And they're going to learn the hard way. Women learn eventually that it doesn't produce a positive situation. It doesn't give you good medical care if you're dealing with someone who treats you badly. It's not good for anyone. And there really has to be a way to educate physicians. Maybe there need to be some more articles in the paper by journalists. You know.
We need to educate journalists too.
Well, I can think of a few people who translate. I know a journalist in the United States who I believe is completely fluent in Armenian. She could take one of the many good articles that we have about what constitutes a good gynecologist, translate it, and get it published here. Why not? We have some good articles that, you know, help women assess their care. I don't know that you've got them in, you know, they may be here in Armenia, they just may not be published yet. Let me ask a few people about that. I didn't know it was that bad.
Well, before we say our final goodbyes, we also wanted to announce that there is a film screening that we were able to secure. Thanks again to Judy's generosity. It's a Brazilian film, Women of Birth, and it's a film about traditional midwifery and ancestral wisdom, following one young woman's journey through indigenous communities, Quilombo settlements, and fishing villages of northeastern Brazil. And there will be a discussion that will be following the screening, and Judy again has so generously agreed to lead that discussion. The screening is going to be on Friday at 7 p.m. at the Fem Library. And maybe what we need to do is kind of, again, spread this like through email lists, and we'll make sure to kind of include you on it. And hopefully we'll get to see you here at the Fem Library as well. I really cannot thank enough Judy for doing this. This was an incredible, incredible conversation, and such an open-hearted conversation that we needed to have. I do hope that this is just the beginning of many other conversations to come with Judy as well. And Judy has been coming to Armenia very, very regularly. So yes, hopefully we'll have more of this. And Gayane, thank you for moderating this discussion. Thank you, all of you, for following this discussion and conversation and for participating with your questions. We can continue to have the conversations while you're having the cupcakes and the lemonade, etc. And
thank you, Lori, and thank you.